I mean, I think that's the brilliance of our system is that we've always had, up until America was founded, we had these systems that were based on the idea that someone's got to lead us. So let's just hope and pray and cross our fingers, and
That they're not a bad leader.
Exactly, that they're a benevolent leader. I mean, in theory, I guess the best kind of leadership structure is a perfect, all-knowing, all-wise,
The hegemon.
Yeah, that kind of.
Yeah, Hobbes. But Hobbes, in his ideological book, right, the Leviathan, he talks about like the best option would be that one person just makes all the decisions and it's for the good of everybody, and we don't have to fight about it, and he's just going to always.
And in theory, sure, but
Sounds
in
great.
the real world that we live in,
doesn't work.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to another 435 podcast. I'm your host, Robert Macfarlane, if you didn't know. Today, I'm doing another candidate interview in the running for Utah State Attorney General. One of the most important seats up on the election ballot this November is Derek Brown. We had a great conversation. I was wildly impressed with how intelligent he is and how much he understands the role already before even going into it. I think you'll enjoy this episode. We talked about federal overreach, state overreach, his real opinions on that. And I think he's going to have a really important and influential impact on Southern Utah specifically as a community when it comes to a couple of specific items. So I'll leave it right there. See ya. Tell me about, for those that don't know you, what's a 30-second highlight of like, what are you most proud of in your life?
30 seconds.
Yeah. Well, like when you think of like, who's Derek Brown? Like, how do you see yourself?
It's, I think a lot of us do it through the people that we have in our family. I have 4 kids, and I mean, a lot of what I do, I do with them in mind. I have 2 boys that are both in college, and then a 10-year gap, and then 2 little kids. Nice. Well, they're like in middle school.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's kind of funny.
They're little kids compared to
they're little. Well, I mean, just last year, we finally got out of elementary school.
Yeah.
Because we've been in the same elementary school with our kids for like, I don't know, it feels like 20 years. But yeah, we have two families, basically. I mean, we call them the bigs and the littles.
That's cool.
And, and it's funny because a lot of people, when they see us together, they'll sort of pull me aside and say, so is this like a second marriage? I'm like, no, this is Emily.
This was totally planned.
Well, it's a pretty inexact science as it goes. But so I have 2 older boys, 2 little ones. And I think in terms of like who I am and how I relate to myself, I think everything has to come through that lens of being a dad.
Yeah.
And a husband.
Yeah. And as I've gotten older, the importance of that family changes, but it seems like, so you went to BYU for your undergrad, Pepperdine Law.
Pepperdine Law. Yep.
And then you kind of have just done like all of the things.
All the things.
Truthfully, like if I was to look at your resume, I'm like, man, he was ambitious is sometimes seen as like a bad word, but it seemed like you were going for impact, meaningful things throughout your whole career.
And and I appreciate you putting it that way, because the reality is I found myself right out of law school. Well, I clerked for a federal judge, so I spent a year of my life with a judge, and I can talk about that later if you want, because it was an incredible experience. But I then get into a law firm, and I'm looking at these partners at this firm, and they're all exceptionally smart, very successful, all of them making 7 figures a year. But I had this nagging feeling like there was something more. Like I didn't know that I wanted to do that. And if I just stuck it out for, 10, 12 years or whatever, I'd make partner. I'd be making the kind of money they were making. And I just remember sitting on the metro coming back from the firm one night on my way home and just thinking, you know what, I don't know that this is what I want to do with my life.
Yeah.
Which is crazy because during law school, I mean, I was taking on debt. It's really frightening when you're taking on a 6-figure debt to go to school, because you're always wondering, how am I going to get this thing paid off? Am I ever going to get it paid off? You're always worrying about that kind of stuff. And you're thinking, well, if I could just make a lot of money, this will solve all my problems. And so all of a sudden I'm in a law firm, I'm making good money. I'm seeing a pathway where I could do financially very well. But I just had this nagging feeling like this is there's got to be more, and I don't know that I'd be really fulfilled. I think everyone is driven by different things. For me, it's more of a mission driven. What's my objective? How do I make a difference? And so
I couldn't help but think, and if you want to pull your mic, if you want to just pull it that way so you're a little more comfortable, yeah, you're good.
Perfect.
Because I feel like I could see you leaning. But when I looked at you're an English major,
yes,
music minor,
yes,
and business minor,
right.
And then you went to law school.
There's a part of me that actually,
I was like, what?
Part of me wanted to be a musician.
Okay.
Like there was a part of me that like a lot of my life, people that don't know me in the political or legal realm probably know me better as a musician, which, for most people in the political realm, they're like, wait, how does that even, compute? What do you mean you're a musician? Well, that's what I did. I mean, during undergraduate, I put myself through school playing for everything from weddings to playing with bands to playing for recording sessions or musicals or that kind of, I mean, I did a lot of that. And there was a part of me that really wanted to go to kind of go the music route. And my father-in-law, funny enough, is a professional musician. He was the music director for Sonny and Cher back in the day.
Interesting.
And for the Dick Van Dyke Show, and he produced for the Jackson 5 at Capitol Records and has kind of an interesting musical career. And as a professional musician, I'll never forget, he said to me, don't do music. Just don't do it. It's just not a good idea.
The funny thing is I wanted to go law school, and everybody who was an attorney was like, don't do it. Don't do it. Which is just funny, right?
Well, it is funny because a lot of people, truthfully, a lot of people hate law school. I mean, just they hate the process. They hate what you're doing. They hate the stress. They hate the whole exercise in Socratic thinking. I was exactly the opposite. I loved it. When people ask me, so how was law school? And I said this, I've taught at BYU as an adjunct professor for years, and I can't tell you how many times a student would come up to me and say, I'm looking at law school. What do you think? And the first thing I always say is, I loved it. Yeah. It was so much fun that getting out and practicing law and making money was kind of a letdown almost, because it was so much fun being on the
learning side.
The learning. I mean, because even classes that I thought would be boring, like wills and trusts, I ended up loving because it's a thought process.
Yeah, it's interesting because until I was thinking about this last night, until I thought about it, I was like, okay, you have art, artistic brain, law, what are the commonalities? And then as I started to think about it, and it's kind of what really attracted me to it, is that there's this logical. In writing, it's typically subjective, right? It's like everybody kind of has their own opinion as to where this goes, but in law, it's like, nope, there's a clear route of how we get to a decision and what is truth, and understanding, in a rule-based system through writing, right? It's like, how do we navigate through that to try to have this structured way of coming to a decision making? And it's almost, there's almost some symmetry in that when it comes to that thought process. But would you say the same thing?
Well, it is, but at the same time, in the law, a lot of the difficulties, or maybe that's not the right word. A lot of the excitement comes from the fact that there sometimes isn't a definitive way to get from A to B.
So maybe because the musical expression of it is your interpretation
it's
of
an art.
It's an art.
It's an art. I mean, and really what it comes down to is there are so many paradoxes that are built into the law that require you to grapple with two competing goods, two competing positives. Yeah. And a lot of people can't. A lot of people struggle with that. I mean, a perfect example is, think of the First Amendment. I mean, everyone thinks of the First Amendment when it comes to religious expression. There's two clauses. One is the free expression, and one's the establishment clause. So the establishment clause is the one that says you can't establish a religion. You can't do anything that is effectively the state promoting one religion over another, right? And then you have the free exercise clause, which is in effect a guarantee that you can express your religion. Well, at some point, the things that government may do in an effort to not establish religion impact your free exercise.
Fringes upon it.
Exactly. And so it's this give and take, it's this tug of war. And so many of the exercises in thought and the legal analysis are grappling with those competing goods. Both of them are positives. Both of them are very good things. We want both. But sometimes trying to accommodate both is difficult, and so it becomes much more subjective.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, that's one of the reasons I loved being a lawyer, and I love the legal process, and I loved law school, was because you're grappling with those competing goods, and two really smart people can look at the same issue or the same problem and come up with totally different results. And then what do you do? I mean, that's where it gets exciting.
But I think that's some of the brilliance of the founding fathers and that Constitution is it's almost like they crashed the two together and they said, okay, we're going to have there has to be tension on both sides. Yes. So that there's never one that's going to fully win out over the other, right? It's like you're giving both people a set of boxing gloves, and then in some cases and in some time frames, one side's going to win, and then in other time frames, the other side's going to win, right? And so there's this. It's almost like set up into that tension to where we're going to tug and war across this line as long as we can make it.
And right? It's not that that's a bad thing. That's just the way the system is designed. I mean, I think that's the brilliance of our system, is that we've always had, up until America was founded, we had these systems that were based on the idea that someone's got to lead us. So let's just hope and pray and cross our fingers, and
that they're not a bad leader.
Exactly, that they're a benevolent leader. I mean, in theory, I guess the best kind of leadership structure is a perfect, all-knowing, all-wise,
the hegemon.
Yeah, that kind of.
Yeah, Hobbes. But Hobbes, in his ideological book, right, the Leviathan, he talks about like the best option would be that one person just makes all the decisions and it's for the good of everybody, and we don't have to fight about it, and he's just going to always.
And in theory, sure, but
sounds
in
great.
the real world that we live in.
Doesn't work.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's why I think it comes back to that in the Federalist Papers, Federalist 51 was where James Madison said, if men were angels, then no external nor internal controls of government would be necessary.
Right.
So the idea is like that very thing. It would be great to have that Hobbesian sort of ideal. And we're just not going to, because we live on planet Earth and human beings are the way they are.
And we've seen that doesn't work out.
It doesn't work. So they said, okay, so let's just assume, for sake of argument, that everyone's going to act in their own self-interest.
Yeah.
And rather than just go, oh, shucks, this is terrible, we're going to just create a system that doesn't just tolerate it, but it encourages it.
Yeah.
And that's the brilliance of our federal system, is you have these three co-equal branches. And a lot of the problems I think we have right now stem from the fact that even though they're technically co-equal, some are more equal than others, and I don't think they should be. And so that's one of those. So yeah,
this is a great segue.
Where,
this is a really good segue because so the Attorney General is the office that you're running for, right?
Right.
So I think if you're listening to this podcast, which I'm sure I kind of know the demographic of the person listening to it, you might already understand kind of the duties and the roles of the Attorney General. But as far as the Justice Department goes, you're not quite Justice Department, but you're not quite executive branch.
Yeah.
Is that a good way of analysis? Am I understanding that right?
I mean, in a sense, it can be viewed as a Justice Department, but not entirely. I mean, what's interesting is the New Mexico Attorney General just rebranded her office as the New Mexico Department of Justice. So she used a little known earlier state law that said that the Attorney General can set up a Department of Justice, and so she rebranded it. But I don't like to look at that analogy, because then that sort of conjures up what happens in Washington with an appointed head of the Department of Justice. Yeah. And I mean, I think we can talk about that and whether it makes sense for the Attorney General to be appointed, because some people have suggested maybe it should be appointed rather than elected, and I don't agree. But
this was the debate. This was because in the first thing I thought, I was like, okay, why are they elected? Why is there a party affiliation if justice is blind, right? If we're going off of like the judicial branch is a separate branch that's supposed to co-balance. Why are we factoring in this party, right? So this is kind of the line of thinking that I was kind of going as I was going through this. So my first challenge was like, why is it even a party nomination? Like I don't quite understand that. So then I kind of start learning a little bit about that. So going back to this Department of Justice, let's stick on that track a little bit.
Let's talk through that.
Yeah. So would you say it's more of an executive arm of the legislature outside of the governor?
Well, and it's not part of the legislature either.
But the legislature passed a law, and then you're supposed to defend the law of the state.
Exactly.
Because you're hey, I'm the attorney, or I'm you're
the chief legal officer, effectively, of the state. And so your job is to defend the law. And really, I mean, you mentioned the justice being blind. I mean, truthfully, the attorney general should defend the laws of the state. And even if the attorney general doesn't like the particular law, I mean, that shouldn't be a factor necessarily. Well, I don't like the law they passed. Shouldn't really be a factor. In fact, my first involvement in the law was I was an intern in the attorney general's office back in the late 90s. And at that time, there was an attorney general named Jan Graham.
And this is in the state of Utah?
In the state of Utah.
Okay.
And there was a law that we had in Utah involving abortion that she refused to defend. And it set up this tug of war that goes to exactly the sort of philosophical question you're asking of, so what happens if the attorney general doesn't like the law? And the answer is it doesn't matter. This is what you do. This is the beauty of the law. When you see the symbol for justice, it's that Lady Liberty with the scales, right, and the blindfold. The idea is, you're balancing these different competing objectives, and you're doing it in a way in which the rule of law is what you're most responsive to. And in that case, the governor and her had this showdown, and in the end, she wouldn't defend it, and so he hired his own attorneys to defend it on behalf of the state.
Right. And so and this is where I found fascinating. I didn't quite understand is in some states like Colorado, for an example. So there was a clean energy bill that was being enforced by the Obama administration on the states, but the Colorado Attorney General felt like it was unconstitutional based off of the Colorado statutes and the law of Colorado that the federal government was doing something that was illegal. So she files suit with the federal government outside of the governor's office, and the governor says, no, you're not allowed to file suit against the federal government. And he tried to exert his executive power to stop her from doing that, takes it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court didn't even listen to the case, told the governor, you can't do that.
She's the attorney general.
She's the attorney general, right? So, and that blew my mind. Yeah. I was like, oh man, this attorney general seat is so important. There's some autonomy there that requires a certain person, I think, that really, I felt like the vetting process of like this attorney general is just not, the importance of it, especially because it's just me, and I felt so unprepared to really like vote. If I was to vote for it, it's like, I don't know, how do I vet, what this person is? But the more and more I learn, is like, it's really important that we understand who this person is and, what they believe in. Right.
Well, and you're right about that autonomy. And that's one of the side effects of having the person being elected.
Yeah.
Is because then who are you really accountable to?
Right.
You're accountable to the people who put you there. Now, that being said, there are certain state statutes which make it really clear the attorney general also represents government institutions. That's just part of our system because you do represent them if they're sued in that capacity. But fundamentally, you're representing the people. And that's why most states, there's been a discussion here in Utah the last, 6 or 7 months about whether the attorney general should be appointed versus elected. It's appointed in D.C., which the way I look at it is not exactly evidence in favor of why we should do it. Personally, I oppose it because I like the idea of that independent accountability to the people who put you there. And also, if you're appointed by someone to that position, then who are you really accountable to? You're accountable to the person who put you there, right? That's fundamentally, that's you can't get away from that concept.
And I get that because that was the position I was thinking about. And then on the flip side, so I listened, there was a Cornell law review paper on specifically the partisanship of the attorney general, right? Because remember, I was going down this road of like this party.
Why is it partisan to begin with?
Why is it partisan?
It's a great question.
So the argument she made is that it's been increasingly more partisan as we've gone over the years, and lots of different reasons why. And one of the challenges with being directly elected upon is that you have the constituency of the people that helps you get elected, and that ends up being there's this partisan because you can raise funds, and then it's whoever can run the best election typically gets elected. It's
right.
A lot less of what am I doing, but how good am I at running for a campaign, right? And then the incumbency, right? Incumbents win about 80+% of the time, no matter what the office is, the incumbent wins. So just there's this heavily weighted, favor to the seat. And I thought, because I think Maine is the only one where the legislature appoints the attorney general. And I thought, okay,
Right.
now if the attorney general is answering to the state that, wrote up the laws, right? And
Right,
the legislatures are writing laws, and then they're defending the laws of the state. That kind of made sense to me, but they're the only ones that do it.
Yeah, I mean, and
43 states elect.
43 do,
yeah.
and then Maine does that with the legislature, and then Tennessee, I believe, is the Supreme Court that appoints the individual, which is another interesting way. And this comes up a lot, I think, because people that would like to keep the partisanship out of the office. I think that's the objective when people raise that issue. But when you look at it, I mean, look at our state. We have 29 counties. Every county has a chief law enforcement officer. You have a sheriff and a county attorney, basically, and they're always elected. So you've got, which makes them accountable to the people who put them there.
Yeah.
And I think for the same reason that those positions don't make sense to have appointed, I don't think at the state level we should either.
Yeah.
Just because you've always got that accountability. But back to your underlying question, why should it be partisan? And what's interesting is in all of the county positions, county attorneys, county sheriffs in every county, it's a partisan position as well.
Yeah.
And all across the country. I mean, and you'd be right to ask, why is it that in Salt Lake County, the district attorney is partisan to begin with? And it is. That's the one county where we have a Democrat district attorney, or there it's a district attorney. In every other county, it's a county attorney. But that's just the way the system is set up. And because there is an inherent it's just inherently political. And are there downsides to maybe that structural setup? Yeah, I mean, one of them is you have to raise funds. I mean, I don't know of anyone who is, any attorney general I've ever met or county prosecutor or county sheriff that likes the fundraising process. I mean, it's the least. I mean, anybody. I used to work with Senator Mike Lee.
Yeah, you were the deputy.
I was
chief
his deputy
of staff,
chief.
right?
Yeah, and I was chief counsel for U.S. Senator Bob Bennett. And I can tell you, every senator that I've ever worked with or had any involvement with, when it comes to raising funds, they just go, oh,
yeah.
Do I have to? Because the reality is, yes, you have to. And no, it's not fun. And it doesn't matter who you talk to in the political world. I mean, we have, 4 members of the State House of Representatives here in the St. George area. And I guarantee if you had a conversation with them and asked them, hey, do you really like that part of it? Every one of them would be like, oh, it's such a drag.
And that's a whole nother topic too. I'd love your opinion on, how could we even go about changing that? But it's another topic for another time. But yeah, it's draining. I've heard that often myself.
And it is ultimately political. And one of the political things, I mean, you had mentioned, the Attorney General in Colorado. I mean, if you want to talk about something that's interesting, is there are areas where attorneys general are pushing back, just like that Attorney General did.
Yeah.
And
they were from different parties. So the attorney general was a Republican and the governor was a Democrat. So you have this inherent, battle between the two, right? Just because of the partisanship at some capacity. But it goes back to that tug of war too, right? Is that
who wins?
Who wins?
I mean, and the way I look at this is it's set up, at the federal level to have the executive, judicial, legislative branch have effectively a tug of war. But we almost never talk about the federalism tug of war. And that's really, to the extent the AG is involved in any really big battle, or AGs collectively, it's that tension. Because the way the system is set up with the state and federal governments, it's not as clear and direct as, at the federal sort of horizontal approach. It's like you have these powers and you have these powers and you get to check each other. At the federal and state way, it's completely different. You have Article 1, Section 8 lists all the things the federal government should be doing. And some of them are broad, like, regulating trade and, treaties.
Protecting the borders.
And, the borders we can talk about the borders. And things like the post office, setting up post offices.
Yeah.
But if it's not in the list, and this is my political philosophy, if it's not on the list, they really shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah.
And
because they didn't think about it back then doesn't mean like, oh, well, they didn't think about it, but we kind of need that, right? It's just like this. Well, there's lots of things that they couldn't have ever been able to think, but
that was the design.
That's a design. The states can figure those things out, and the public sector can figure those things out.
And so you do those things, and if it's not on the list, let the states should do the remainder. Should be the default.
And
should be that the states get
if we
that.
want to amend it, we can amend it, and there's a process to do that.
Exactly. If they've really if they
really
didn't
important.
think about something and it really needs to be on that list,
We have a process
well,
for that.
there's a process for it. And absent that process, I mean, and this is my political philosophy coming through loud and clear, but that's what I've always believed is you have this back and forth. And can I tell you what's interesting? The state legislature just did something about a month ago in their legislative session on this very issue.
Okay.
They passed a bill. It's a state, what they called it, the State Sovereignty Act, SB 57. And the idea behind it was that the federal government forces us to do things all the time that we don't believe they have the authority to do. And I can get in, if you want, to some of the really interesting examples of things they do. But
You're the one with the limit on time. I would love to talk about some of those examples.
Let's talk about some of those, because there's some really interesting stuff that is, some of it is infuriating, some of it is comical. I mean, it's really interesting how far the federal government goes into our life. But so what the legislature did is they said, all right, the way that we've always interacted with the federal government is they tell us what to do. And if we think it exceeds their authority in terms of mandating we do something, we just do it anyway. Mm-hmm. And then we say, "Oh, shucks, you shouldn't have done that." And then if we are really, really angry, then we file a suit against them and say, "We really think that you shouldn't have told us to do that, or you didn't have the authority to mandate that."
Right.
So what this bill does is it inverts that paradigm.
Okay.
It says, okay, if you ask us to do something that we specifically feel like violates our rights as a state, and they had a few things in mind, like when they're closing down certain baseload power plants and stuff like that. I mean, the big stuff.
That's a big thing.
Yeah. So the idea is, if you think that, if you want us to do something and we believe that it exceeds your authority, we're actually not going to do it. And then you can sue us as a state, and then we will defend that suit. You have to force us to do it. So the default won't be we're just going to do it.
Yeah, you have the burden. Of proof.
Exactly. So the burden shifts to the
and
federal government.
It should have been. It seems like it should have been that way at the beginning.
Yeah. Well, and right, and this is, I mean, not to be sort of crass, but this is sometimes how you can tell someone's most basic political philosophy and maybe party affiliation and a few other things. It's, absent, when there's doubt in terms of who gets the right or who has the authority to do something, the federal government or the states, where do you default?
Yeah.
And I default to the states.
Every time.
Because, well, that's how the system was set up. That's how the structure is in place. That's what the 10th Amendment says. For me, that seems like a no-brainer. The problem is the federal government has just, it's like this Leviathan that has just creeped into every area of our life. And one of the roles of the Attorney General is to push back in specific areas. Mm-hmm. So if since this bill passed, if there are specific areas where we anticipate the federal government coming after us, I mean, the question that needs to be asked is, as Attorney General, are you going to defend those laws? I mean, are you going to defend the state against whatever lawsuit that is?
Right.
So that, for me, is the most fundamental question. But the federal government, I mean...
I think of the battles, and then I think of your career so far, the success you've had. Why would you raise your hand to do that job?
You are not the first person.
This is the question I told you I was going to lead with, which we didn't lead. We're 40 minutes in, and we haven't got there yet. But why would you... I mean, what is it? One of the statements I read last night was aspiring governor is what AG actually stands for.
Oh, man.
And I don't want to put that on you. I don't want to say that that's...
I can promise you that is not the case.
Okay.
Not at
Fair
all.
enough.
But that has been kind of a joke, I think, through the years, as I think there are a lot of AGs with aspirations. This is, for me,
and a lot of times
absolutely
they do move up the ladder, right? Because of how important of a job it is, how much influence the job already has. And if you can prove yourself at that level, it seems to me like there's not a whole lot of other things that you couldn't do, right? Because I'm just thinking about what the duties are of that.
It's complex. It's complicated. It is convoluted. I mean, absolutely. But to answer your question in a nutshell, I've had some of my closest friends, like behind closed doors or at a restaurant, look at me and just say, why would you put yourself and your dear little family through this, because you're going to have your opponents are going to say every sort of crazy thing about you. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be hard. And the answer is, I think I can make a difference here. I mean, and my background, I mean, and it sounds like you've kind of looked at some of the things I've done. I was in the House of Representatives. Mm-hmm. I had an opportunity to make a difference with Senator Lee. So I stepped out and helped him. I did that for a period of time. And then I left that and went back to the private sector. When it came time to running as the Utah Republican Party chair, I did that. I stepped in, stepped out when it was over, and moved back into the private sector. And I felt like in each of those positions, it was a brief moment of time where I could serve. I could take what I had learned in my career and the relationships I'd made, and I could make a difference for the state in a way that I couldn't. And then I moved back to private life. I mean, that's the way the system was designed. I mean, I'm very supportive of term limits, for instance. I mean, I think term limits, the system is designed for people to step up, serve, and step out. I mean, that's the George Washington model. You get in, make a difference, and then
do you think, though, that as you get closer to home, like as you get closer to your central community, I can't help but think of like the community elders, right? Like if we were to just go back 150 years and think, okay, the government was so far away and they had to ride horses, and it was like weeks before you could get like, messages to them. So there's the autonomy, the world wasn't so small, right? And so there was a lot of wisdom in the length of time. So like as you get closer to home, those term limits, I battled with this because, I had one of the city council members tell me, for St. George, tell me, I just feel like there's still a few things left that I really can make an impact on, and I know I've been here a while, and I just know that I can continue to make a positive impact, and I'm in the hunt already, right? There's things moving along, and I couldn't help but think there's some disruption in keeping things together and having stability in the local community. What are your thoughts on it?
I mean, it's the tension. It's the tension. It's the balancing, because I mean, is it true that if you just have the same people in there forever, that you'd have that kind of continuity? Yes, but there's also problems with
nepotism.
And not shaking it up. And I think having a regular turnover of people serving is a good thing. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about social structures or religious structures or government structures. No one is indispensable. You know what I'm saying?
Agreed.
No one is. I mean,
agreed.
I mean, the reality is, someone can be a very powerful sitting governor in Utah for, 12 years.
We've been through that.
Yeah. And then they leave, and smooth transition of power, new person, and everyone kind of forgets who the previous person was. And that's okay.
And it's just enough shakeup to really like, oh man, there's a lot of amazing things that were accomplished with a fresh set of eyes.
Right.
Right.
And I think there's also a power structure that is part of anyone in office, and disrupting that on a regular basis is probably a good thing.
Yeah.
Keeping that moving and keeping new ideas, and the fact that turnover is part of the system. I mean, that's why I support term limits, and that's why, you mentioned the high number of people getting reelected in Congress. I think it's like 93% of members of the House of Representatives that are reelected. I mean, it's just it's almost impossible to beat someone who's an incumbent. I mean, because they have all the resources, they have the name ID. I mean, it takes a very unique, wealthy person with a lot of name ID to break into that kind of a structure, and so it just doesn't happen very often. But I just think this is, the George Washington model was great. I mean, the guy literally could have been king.
Yeah.
And he said, no, let's divide the power up. Let's give it back to the people. He spent 2 terms, and then he went back to Mount Vernon and said, I'm passing the baton to someone else. And I think that's how it should be. I think in every situation.
And we did it again after World War II with Eisenhower. He became the president. He ran. He led the way. We got to a victory, and then he took over as a presidency. And I think there's a quote in there. Somebody might look it up, but he talks about having like we need to do nothing right now. We need to everybody needs to just calm down. I need to be the least productive president in history, right? It's like
Let's
we need to
stop the frenetic energy
exactly
of
of like what we've gone through for a decade, right? And so I think of like those, you have these leaders of like level-headed thinking, right? Of saying, okay, it's not this power structure is set up this way, and we need to know when we're overly the kinetic energy. I feel like we're in a little bit of that moment right now too, right?
Sometimes that is the case, and I feel like that's been the case with the federal government during the last a couple of decades, and because the frenetic energy of it's really the ones running this country are not. I mean, with all due respect to our members of Congress, who I think do a really good job here in Utah, they're not the ones solving the real issues or really running the country. It's the mid-level government bureaucrat lawyers who are writing the regulations. Mm-hmm. Because what happens is they'll pass a bill that it's sort of watered down and not very effective. And the reason it's watered down is they can't get it passed unless it's watered down to the point of worthlessness. In fact, I just read that, just saw that there was I think the member of Congress on House Ways and Means in the Republican Party just stepped down today, which gives Republicans a 1-vote majority.
Oh my gosh.
So to get a bill through, if you're a Republican, I mean, how do you get a bill through? It's got to be so completely watered down and worthless. So what happens is they pass these bills that'll say, there shall henceforth be clean air in all the land. And then at the bottom of the bill, it says, and the EPA gets to determine what clean air is because, Congress, we don't have the votes or the wherewithal to actually legislate like we should.
We don't want to be held accountable to this on the next election cycle.
Exactly. So we're going to let the EPA do it. We're going to let the mid-level government bureaucrats determine what that looks like. And then if you were watching this week on you probably saw the EPA and the car issue. Mm-hmm. So they have what they call the tailpipe pollution rule that just came out. And what they're doing is they're forcing manufacturers of cars by 2032 to have a certain percentage. I forgot if it was like 62 or something, 62% of all their vehicles have to be EV or hybrid. Now, that is a massive, I mean, from a regulatory standpoint and a policy change in America, this is like few things are bigger, more monstrous in terms of just the impact than that. So who made that decision? Not a single member of Congress. Like not a single person that we elected to go to D.C. actually had a role in making that decision. It was a bunch of mid-level managers at the EPA. And in theory, the head of the EPA who's appointed by President Biden. So if you're going to point fingers at someone, it's President Biden. But he's using those regulations in a way to advance an agenda.
That's assuming that he has the wherewithal to do the absolute enormous job of running the country and understanding and making sure that he's perfectly appointed people, and he has to oversee the EPA guy who he really thought was a great guy, but then he can't look at every single thing that this guy's going through and anticipate that this is that person's going to do. But we just keep giving the executive more power. We just keep giving him more. Yep. Like the TikTok bill. Why does the president
get to determine
that out of all the talking heads that I've heard talk about this bill? No one brought up one time about how the president was the one identifying whether or not these applications fit this criteria, this weird criteria that they made for whether something is against national security, essentially, right? But they gave it all to the president. I'm like, why? Why did the legislature just give him more power? I don't get it.
Because they don't have the wherewithal to make those determinations themselves. And so they give it to the president. And then I'll tell you,
I'm getting fired up. I can feel it.
Well, no, but here's the thing. I mean,
it didn't make sense.
Like when it comes to who's in the White House, I mean, I obviously, strongly want a Republican in the White House this fall. And I'll tell you why. The real power in this country lies in what's called the Office of Presidential Personnel. And that office, the OPP office itself, that's where the power is, because there are roughly 4,000 appointed positions in the federal government.
Right.
And the people running the country making those very decisions, like that you're talking about in the TikTok instance, it's not the president. It's going to be the people in commerce or transportation or treasury that are really the ones making the decisions. Well, who's putting them in those positions?
Right.
It's the Office of Presidential Personnel.
Right.
It's so really, it's not just who's in the White House. It's what party is controlling who's in the White House.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, when I worked in D.C., that I realized really quickly. I was there in 2004 during a transition of power after George Bush won re-election, and saw again kind of the levers of power and people going in and out of a lot of these executive offices. And I realized that that's where the real power in this country lies. And then that's what an attorney general does, is utilize the ability to file lawsuits on behalf of the state to challenge. What they'll do is they'll take a regulation and like reinterpret it. So can I give you an example of a funny one that happened a couple of years ago? The Department of Energy, for like 25 years, since I think 92, they've had the ability to regulate shower heads, faucets, and I think urinals, and those three things. Well, recently they said, you know what? We think that also means dishwashers. And so they then created this new set of regulations mandating how dishwashers will use water and mandating that none of them can use beyond, I think it's 3.2 gallons of water per cycle, which is fairly crazy. And then they have energy requirements. And so what it has done is it's forced manufacturers of dishwashers to make dishwashers that don't really work. And it's become kind of a running joke. Well, recently, a group of state attorneys general, led by the attorney general in Louisiana, Liz Murrill, filed a lawsuit saying, you don't have Congress didn't give you the authority to do that.
Yeah.
And fortunately, the federal courts agreed and said, actually, yeah, we're looking at the statute. We're not seeing where you got the authority to do that. Now, the problem is for every time that kind of a lawsuit has been filed and won, there's 150 times when no one's filed a lawsuit and they just do it anyway.
Well, and then think of like the money, the resources, the time, and everything that was built around this. Like some middle, managing, bureaucrat. Like, I think I have a great idea to save water, right? And then everybody, all the yes people in the room are like, yeah, that's actually great water. When you write it down on an Excel spreadsheet, it looks great.
It looks great.
That saves a bunch of water.
Well, and a lot of times what's going on right now is
be damned.
Well, exactly, and not only that, but you've got things like a climate agenda. I mean, the Tailpipe Pollution Act. Yeah, I mean those regs were a function of someone pushing a political agenda. Yeah, even though they don't have the authority to do it. And so this is one of my beefs with Congress. And I've seen this firsthand. I mean, like immigration is an absolute mess, and Congress could solve it tomorrow.
It was a mess in 2001. It was a mess. I mean, I just think about the debates in that first Bush administration and how basically September 11th just derailed this whole thing. That was the conversation, right? We had just come out of NAFTA with Bill Clinton. We were trying to figure out how do we have this free trade agreement within, this hemisphere, and we have all these people coming across the border, and we had really, especially the Republican Party is just like such a lost opportunity for us to really tackle something that would have resonated over the last couple of decades. And we didn't solve it then, and we just kept passing it down the line. And now we're here at just like a crazy moment.
And because no one wants anyone else to either solve it or get credit for it. I mean, one of my frustrations when I worked in the Senate was the fact that even areas like H-1B visas, so immigration worker visas, one of the problems they've had is that the caps are too low. Like what'll happen is people will apply to bring people here on worker immigration visas, and by February in the year, like the cap's already been hit. Well, these are many times highly skilled, IT workers or whatever. I mean, people that we legitimately would want to come, and companies are asking to bring them here. Everyone agrees you should just raise the caps, and Congress even can't do that, because what'll happen is they'll introduce a bill raising the caps, and I saw this firsthand where Democrats then add onto it an amnesty provision, and Republicans go, wait, time out. We can't vote for that, and the response is, oh, it's because you're anti-immigrant, you're racist.
Yeah,
go ahead, vote against the bill. See, Republicans are voting against, raising the caps on H-1B visas. They don't want high-skilled immigration workers. Well, that's not the case, but that's the narrative that gets spun up. And that's why I mean, that example of immigration, that right there explains everything going on right now with the funding bill that just got passed with all the pork, the FISA reauthorization bill that just got passed,
So
Ukraine funding, all of them. That dynamic takes place with all of them.
and this is I'm literally coming up with this, and I'm really not smart. So like, stop me if you're like, no, you're
I don't know
off
that
track.
I buy that, but
Stop me if I'm off track. So going back to the burden of proof, right? We were talking
Right.
about that. And you have the state of Texas, Utah just passed this as well is we can deport
Yes.
illegal immigrants here, right? We no longer can trust that the federal government is going to do what they're constitutionally required to do. So we're going to pass our own laws within the state of Utah. Couldn't we just flip it and say, hey, we're going to pass our own immigration rules and we're going to have this cap on this visa for the state of Utah?
Well, that's in a sense, that's what Texas tried to do. So they passed a bill, SB 4, that says they could detain people who aren't here legally.
Right.
And that's been the subject of this last week. We've had a lot of whiplash on that bill because there was an appeals court that said they couldn't, or a district court that said they could do it, and then appeals court that said they couldn't.
And now we're in a
and then
holding
Supreme
pattern.
Court, that said they could, and then it went back to the appeals court. And it's this kind of whiplash. But that's the question. Is can they do that? And here's the legal issue. And we talked about these paradoxes and the tensions. Is even within the Constitution there are tensions built in. So it's one of the articles of the Constitution says that the federal government has control over things like immigration and naturalization, and we've always accepted that they do. I mean, it says there, I believe it's Article 1, Section 8. Like this is one of their authorities. But then you've got Article 4 that says that the states have the authority to protect themselves from invasion. So it's the invasion clause. So here we have the federal government, and one of the greatest ironies of all is the fact that we have a federal government that's injected itself into every conceivable area of our lives, even as far as our dishwashers, right? And yet the one thing that conservatives like me absolutely agree it's their right to do, which is monitoring the border, policing the border, they're actually not doing.
They're not doing it.
So that's, for me, one of the greatest ironies. But again, what Governor Abbott in Texas did is he wrote a letter and he said, look, yes, the federal government has the right to protect the border, but we also have a what may be a contravening or a coexisting right to protect our state from invasion if we believe there's an invasion. And so this gets back to the tension you and I talked about earlier, which is, okay, what's the default? If there is a legitimate question between the two, to where do you default? And my default is almost always the states.
The state.
And in this case, I would say, well, the federal government should do its job.
Yeah.
And they're not. And that's the problem.
It seems to me like it seems like in a court of law, if I was to make the case that there's a willful neglect of the border, it seems like there's enough evidence to show willful neglect.
Well, and the problem is, I think you could make the case because, I mean, a number of our members of Congress have been down there recently, and you've had John Curtis on the show, and John was one of those who recently made the comment. He said, I went down and I talked about this. He said, like, the cartels are controlling the borders.
Yeah.
Like, he's like, where we were standing, looking at the wall, looking at, people coming through, looking at, ICE agents. He's like, there were lookout towers where the cartels were watching us.
Yeah.
And the problem is now the cartels have shifted their resources away to some degree from drugs and to human trafficking because the margins are higher. I mean, isn't that?
And there's actually no repercussion. If we send them back, they just make more money when they decide to turn around and come back.
Like a repeat customer.
It's a repeat customer.
It doesn't. Yeah, it's tragic that that's the reality that we have, and that we have a government that's not doing anything about it because there are innocent victims. I mean, and the victims are human beings. And then we have the issue last year of roughly 3.3 or so million people crossing the border into the United States illegally. I mean, that's roughly the size of the state of Utah. I mean, that's about how many people we have here as well.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's an interesting dilemma, and I think that and to bring this all back to the Attorney General position, this is one of the things that Attorneys General do. We have 28 of us in this country that would be Republicans if I were elected. There are 28. And a lot of the power from those positions comes from working together, filing suits, pushing back on strategic areas where you can actually make an impact.
So this was another aha that I had, was these coalitions. These it's basically they're statewide coalitions of attorneys general, right? And so I in the legislature you have a proportional amount of representation based off population, but we've capped it at 435 members of the House, right? And we have 2 senators per each state, but there's 1 attorney general in every single state. So we have this level playing field that is being played out in the legal world of the country, and it's a legitimate battle being played out, right?
Yeah.
I think is fair to say.
Well, and it makes sense that
it's based around party lines too, right? Because you have the Republican Attorney General administration, and you have the Democratic Attorney General, Daga and Raga, right?
Exactly, yeah,
and so how you have these 2 administrative coalitions essentially, and they kind of battle it out.
Yeah,
quite often. Right?
Well, and
I didn't know that. I had no it just didn't hit my radar.
Well, and crazy. Also it's a somewhat of a new dynamic in our country.
Yeah, just in basically the last couple decades. Right? Only like the last 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's 20 years ago. It was much more I was about to say administrative, but it's not. It's never been an administrative position, but it was less political. And I think now, as a group, they're seeing that they can make an impact on policy in ways they couldn't before. And I think a lot of this, to be really honest, is a reflection of Congress not doing their job. And the fact that all these new agency regulations are popping up that are controlling us here in Utah. I not long ago, I spoke with the Utah Sheriff's Association, and the questions that I got at the end of my speech were all about lands in Utah, and they were from counties like Garfield County, which is where the county seat's Panguitch. So 90 minutes from here. Yeah. 93% of the county is owned and controlled by the federal government.
Yeah.
And
only 11% of Washington County is owned privately.
Is that what? 11%,
I mean, 11% of Washington County.
I mean, the reality is what can you do then with that? I mean, it's what it means is the federal government basically owns and controls that land. But it still imposes requirements on the counties. So like Garfield County has the Grand Escalante Monument. People will go hiking there. They'll have search and rescues there. The counties are responsible for, all the fees and whatever. And they do get compensated from the federal government, but pennies
as long
on the
as
dollar.
As long as they're towing the line. Don't get out of line.
Well, and what they get is like this much.
Yeah.
They call it payment in lieu of taxes, or PILT funding. And it's pennies on the dollar of what they could make if it were privately held.
Yeah.
And so the point of this, and just to kind of bring this back to this whole issue of the federal government overreach, when I worked with Senator Lee, we had in his office, and this was 2015, so it was when the Obama was in office, we had this cabinet. It's when you walk in the DC office. It was about 4.5, 5 feet tall and about this wide. And on the top of the cabinet, we had every bill that had been passed by Congress the previous year. So there were about 600 pages of new congressional laws. So 600 pages. We had it just like sitting on top of the cabinet. In the cabinet were all the new agency regulations passed in the same year. There were 3 individual stacks. If you put them up end on end, it was about 11 feet tall. 60,000 pages. So in other words, and that's just to put in perspective, I mean, that right there, I mean, we got to just let that sink in. That's what's going on in America, is you have, for every new congressional law passed, every new one page, there were roughly 100 pages of regulations. So it was like Congress says there shall be clean air, and the EPA says 100 pages later, here's what we think clean air is, and we get to regulate it, and here's what we'll do to you if you don't agree with us. And so that is where the real power is.
All the while, the capitalistic economy that has held all of the stuff together, right, is sitting here trying to make different changes depending on what happens in these regulatory situations, especially when it comes to energy, right? If we land on climate and energy, and we change let's just say we're not going to call it climate, we're going to call it energy, because truthfully that's what it is, right? We're really debating as to how we get energy. How should we do energy, right? And you have, the second largest power, building 300 coal plants, right? This year, 300. They're opening a coal plant like every single, like 2 a week, right? And they have 27 nuclear power plants that they're on the books, and we have 1, and we're shutting down all of our coal power plants. And it's like, when energy is the largest piece of this inflation, if you look at, whenever, that's the reason why they pull out, the CPI inflation versus, regular inflation, right? Energy is such this massive part of our life and the residual impact into our economy. And when we put all these regulations in play, how is our capitalistic society supposed to compete with one that's not capitalistic at all and completely controlled?
Exactly.
Right, from the bottom up.
And this, what you just identified, is something that this is going to hit us hard in Utah, because last year,
oh my gosh,
this is the first year.
This is why I had John on. The main reason I had John on, he's running for the Senate, but
to talk about these energy issues.
He's talking about energy. I've tried to kind of ring the bell in southern Utah. I was like, hey, listen, this is going to be a problem for us. We think water's a problem. Energy is going to be a problem for us. We're already, the state of Utah is the second least expensive, right? We have the least expensive energy in almost the entire country. But 2 of the most expensive in our entire state, 2 cities, are here in Washington County. We have some of the highest energy bills in all of Utah, and we rank, on the west coast quite high, because part of our energy is only produced up north, and there's only a few competitors to it, right?
Right. So, and what's interesting is this last year was the first time ever in Utah's history where we used more power than we created. So, I mean, and okay, do you remember how earlier we were talking about this bill, SB 57, that flips the narrative in the event Congress asks us to do something? I'll tell you the real driver behind that bill. In fact, you've got a representative here in Southern Utah, Colin Jack, who, this is his area. I mean, you should chat with him, because he works in this industry, and one of the reasons he pushed this was specifically because of the EPA and their attempts to shut down these baseload power plants. I mean, if there's one issue driving that bill and that paradigm shift that we want to have, it's energy, because there is an EPA rule that is trying to shut down the power plant in the Price area. And the idea is they want it shut down within 8 years. And sure, we can replace it with, say, nuclear, but for a nuclear plant, it's 20 years. Exactly. So we've got a difference of, so there's 12 years there with what? What are we going to do?
And we still have to find somebody to go say, oh yeah, well, I'll invest a couple $2 billion in nuclear energy and not make any money for 20 years. And
right. I mean, the state of Utah is not building these plants.
Exactly.
I mean, we don't want them to. I mean, we want an environment where private companies can come in and do that, but the federal government is stopping that from taking place. And so this is It's
weird. It's really weird.
And yet it makes perfect sense if you're looking at it from a political standpoint of an agenda that a certain group are pushing. So that's why it's important that we have every state, like Utah, has a law enforcement official or an attorney who is authorized to represent the state and file these suits on behalf of the state or defend them when they come in. I mean, that's the reality. I mean, if I had to in a nutshell say, well, this is not a nutshell. That was a very long explanation leading up to this. But if you were to say, so give me one reason why you're even doing this at all. That's it.
This is a big one.
This is one of the biggest issues. There's lots of other things we could talk about, but really that's what it comes down to, because the reality is under our system of government, Utah is a separate sovereign power. I mean, that's the way it's set up.
Yeah.
And, it was probably 10 years ago. Do you remember they had the Obamacare decision at the Supreme Court? Mm-hmm. It was like we were all kind of waiting to see what would happen, because Congress passed this bill saying everybody has to purchase health care.
Yeah.
And a lot of people said, yeah, I'm not interested in doing that. And the response is, we don't care. We're the federal government. We're telling you to do it. And then the question was, well, where do they get the authority to do that?
Right.
And they hadn't really thought of that concept before they passed the bill. But the idea they came up with after the fact was, well, this is an exercise of Congress's taxing power. It's just a tax.
Yeah, because if you don't do this, then I'm going to tax you.
Well, yeah, exactly. So that was their argument. Was this is just another form of the taxing power? No big deal. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court, with Justice Roberts, authoring the opinion, said no, this actually is a valid exercise of taxing power. And so conservatives like me were pretty ticked off. But interestingly, in the opinion, it said, and the actual quote, if I remember it exactly, he said, the states are separate and independent sovereigns. Sometimes they have to act like it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the point. Sometimes they have to act like it. So I believe Utah as a state is a separate independent sovereign. It needs elected officials, including an AG, who's willing to make sure that it acts like it.
Man, I got like 50 other questions. I'm going to take a quick break. We're going to take a quick break.
Okay.
Let's take a quick break and we'll be right back, guys. We're in the thick of it because I want to talk so much about so many different things.
I think we could go like another 3 hours. We could go until
it. This is a good sign. So, one of the biggest, when I was researching AGs, right, and I was looking at their histories, one of the things that jumped out is that either currently or just recently, your main job was working for one of the largest lobbying firms, I think, in the country. Is that right?
Well, no, it's a firm here in Utah. I did legal work and lobbying and government relations and a lot of different things. So it's larger as far as Utah's concerned, but from a national standpoint, not very large.
It's like the dirtiest word, I feel like lobbying. It's just,
you know what? Like, when Senator Lee ran the first time,
I thought real estate agent was bad. Because I'm a real estate agent. It's like used car salesman, real estate agent, lobbyist.
Exactly.
Like right there
well, and lawyer. I mean,
I've been a
lawyer.
Right there, man.
I mean, it's like the ultimate political pot shot. I mean, and it's funny when Senator Lee ran the first time in 2010, there were ads saying Senator Lee's a lawyer, and then there were other ones, and they would say it like that, lawyer, and then they'd say lobbyist.
Yeah.
Well, was he really a lobbyist? Well, yeah, I mean, what he was is someone who represented clients, and he had large tech companies that had legal issues he was advising on. And then if all of a sudden the legislature was going to legislate on one of those issues that impacted the company, I mean, was he at that point going to go, oh, that sounds like lobbying, I better not do that?
Right.
Of course not.
Right.
I mean, any lawyer can provide legal advice. Only the best lawyers can get their heinies up to the Capitol and sit down with legislators and make the case for why what they're about to do actually either doesn't do what they think it does, or number two, they shouldn't do it to begin with. Because a lot of times legislators are doing the best they can, but they may not realize the impact of what they're doing. I mean, we've been talking about federal government overreaching into the states. Yeah. I mean, let's be honest, the state government overreaches into companies and private lives all the time. And
which is another huge duty of the AG, right? This is another huge duty of representing the people and protecting businesses from overreach on the state, right? So who have you represented, or maybe give if somebody's listening in and they're trying to understand what you've done for those businesses, like who?
Well, let me give you boy, there's a number of I've worked with a lot of tech companies. That's been an area that I really like, the tech and the technology space. But one is like Turo, for instance. So Turo it's like Airbnb, but for your car. Yeah. I'll bet most of your listeners have either heard of Turo or they've used Turo.
They may actually make money off of Turo right now.
I mean, there's
in St. George too. Yeah,
there are tens of thousands of Turo hosts in Utah right now. So I guarantee someone listening is like, that's what they do.
Yeah, exactly.
And there was a bill that was so I'd worked with Turo. We were giving them advice dealing with tax issues. We were giving them advice involving regulatory stuff, and the airport was giving him some grief. And then there was a bill that was introduced to the legislature, which would effectively have regulated them out of existence. So this was like, remember the battle between the taxi drivers and Uber?
Mm-hmm.
It was that all over. And so you had the rental car companies had this bill that they were hoping to get passed, which would make every individual Turo host be subject to all the same regulations that, Hertz or Enterprise or whatever were subject to. Mm-hmm. In other words, putting him out of business in Utah.
Right.
So my job was, as somebody who understood the legalities, was to help them out, meet with legislators and say, hey, this bill, do you realize what this is going to do? And some of them would say, well, it won't do that because of, X, Y, and Z. And I'd walk them through the legal language because as a lawyer, like I understood the language. I understood how it cross-referenced other areas of the code. I understood how it implicated tax issues and regulatory issues. And I could speak as a lawyer on the bill and show them exactly why what they thought it was going to do wasn't going to do. Or just make the case why philosophically, this is kind of one of the, the old dinosaurs in an industry trying to shut down the new upstart tech companies.
Yeah.
And we were successful in the end. I mean, it took some work. and it was a difficult issue. But as a lawyer, that's one of the benefits that I brought to the system is not only was I able to help them with just the standard legal type issues, but I could help them advocate. I mean, these are people that I've known and I've worked with. And some can say, well, that sounds like lobbying. Well, yeah, you can call it whatever you want, government relations. Yeah, I call it representing my clients and doing a really good job of getting the best policy, because really that's what we're looking for. I mean, would we have wanted a policy that put Uber out of business and left us with a bunch of taxi cabs in Utah?
Yeah, that don't do a good job?
Yeah, nobody wants that.
Right.
So in the same way, I mean, do you really want a policy in Utah that would have left us with only rental companies and not options like Turo?
Right.
Well, no. And so that was my job. That's what I did. And just as a side note, it's a lot of fun.
Is it?
I mean, and I'm currently not doing that. I don't have any of those clients at the moment. I am campaigning full time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, every now and then you'll hear someone say, well, it sounds like there's a conflict of interest because you used to represent, well,
I couldn't help but think that. Like myself, when I was thinking about it, I was like, how does he work for a lobbying company? And then now he's supposed to check some of the rules in which those lobbying companies are advocating for.
Well, what's interesting is those companies probably, I don't know if they would like the fact that I'm running, but it doesn't matter. I'm running.
Right.
And the reality is I know a lot of these areas. I mean, I've worked with, another client I worked with was Meta. And my job was to bring them to the table, sit down with legislators, with the governor's office, with the Department of Commerce, Consumer Protection, and figure out how do we resolve one of the most difficult, thorny issues of our generation, right? The governor here said, look, we need to figure this out because social media is impacting kids. But we can't just outlaw it because, well, we have a constitution. Right, and that has First Amendment protections. I mean, as a funny side note, the governor outlawed TikTok on all state devices, right? And he could do that because they're state devices. Montana just outlawed TikTok altogether. Well, that didn't stand up in court, and they wasted a lot of time because any lawyer that looked at the legal argument said, well,
there's like 7 TikTok users in Montana. So they tested it out over there.
Maybe.
They're like, we need to set a precedent. Let's try it in Montana.
Exactly.
Nobody's really going to be all that upset.
Line.
Everybody in Montana is like, what's TikTok?
Well, but the legal arguments played out exactly as the attorneys like myself knew they would. And so like with Meta, one of the things we've been trying to do is to sit down and work with legislators and the governor's office and try and come up with solutions to really difficult questions. And I mean, like, how do you navigate the First Amendment issues, the technology issues, the social issues, the legislative issues? How do you integrate them into a set of legislative language that's constitutional and that will actually do the job that you want it to do? I mean, another state that didn't do a very good job of this was Arkansas, because they passed a bill and then it got thrown out by the federal court because they weren't able to navigate those. So I mean, the bottom line is I'm proud of the fact that I've worked really hard as a lawyer to try and navigate these battles, and these are tough issues.
Yeah, I think when you were talking earlier about kind of going from the private to the public, to basically you're going from money making to service, right? You're trying to balance. You're doing your own tug of war with saying, okay, as a human existing and wanting to do meaningful work, right? What are the things that pull you into these different categories? And clearly, I think you've made a lot of smart decisions in understanding ultimately where this job is headed, right? As the AG, I think because of where you've worked in these different positions, right? Whether it was state legislature, the party, as the lobbyist, now you're going to understand things that I think there's probably a rare few that are going to really be able to understand at that same level.
And I think that the reality is, I mean, you asked about the, sort of why is this an inherently political position? Well, the AG's office gets funded by the legislature. You've got to work with the legislature. Yeah. I mean, like I will stand alone. I've done it before. When I was state party chair, there were times when I stood alone because I did something that I felt was the right thing to do, and I'm happy to do that. But also, we have a legislature that you have to work with, and they fund the office. And I think having those relationships, some people look at the fact that I built up these relationships and I can work with people, and the Speaker of the House actually has endorsed me, and the Senator Mike Lee has endorsed me, and they may see that as a negative. I see that as a positive. I see that as the fact that on day one, I can go, I mean, these federal overreach issues, like I've already been talking with the Speaker of the House. And if you think I'm passionate about this, oh, you should talk with him.
Yeah.
I mean, he is fired up. And I've sort of jokingly said to him with these lawsuits that involve federal overreach, I said, look, if you fund it, I'll file it. I mean, he and I are on lockstep on this. But I think having that background, I mean, some people will criticize me for it for the same reason they criticized Mike Lee. I mean, it's a cheap political point. I mean, and people,
you're never going to keep everybody happy either, by the way. No. Like, and so
I mean, I mean, everyone in this race, you're going to hear people trying to score cheap political points. And that's the nature of politics, and that's frankly one of the reasons why I had to think really long and hard before I decided to do this, because I'm like, do I really want my name and my family? I mean, I mean, some of the attacks that my wife and I have already kind of seen, it's kind of gross. But I knew it was coming. But the question is it worth it for an opportunity to make a difference in a state that I love? And for me, the answer is yes.
Hey, it's meaningful work. I appreciate you doing it and running, because you could do a lot of other things, make a lot more money, and have a lot more time with your family and not do this. So the fact that you're choosing to do this tells me a lot about you.
Well, I've got a mountain bike that used to be used all the time down here on trails, and I haven't used it in a long time because I'm doing this.
Well, so hopefully you get some break time while you're down here.
I
at
hope
least.
so. Well,
but the state convention's on April 27th. The delegates you're running, are you doing signatures and caucus? You're doing both. Yep. But I'm
working the delegate. I mean, that's what I'm here in St. George doing, just meeting. We had a delegate event last night in Tokerville. Yep. Got one tonight here in Santa Clara. I mean, it's
sweet.
We're doing there's 4,000 of them. I'd love to talk to every one of them. I'm going to try.
I'm not a state delegate. I'm not a state delegate, but I'm a county delegate.
You're county, okay.
I got elected as a county delegate. So I was one of 5 people that rose their hand, and 5 people got put in as delegates. So there you go.
So you're going to convention.
So I'm going to convention tomorrow. So I'll see you tomorrow. But best of luck to you.
Thank you.
And hopefully we'll have you on again.
Appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun.